and gives me great pleasure to bring on board Venkatram to talk about what his understanding of the year, the world and the Deloitte businesses. So good to meet you in person. We've been talking on Zoom and various other video interferences, but nothing like the real world.
Absolutely, Nikunj. Of course, with a 6-foot distance, which is nice.
It's been a tough year. It's been a rough year, but it's a year which in a sense belongs to humanity. Where we were at the beginning of the year versus where we are right now. It's a delight, it's a relief, and it's a happy feeling.
Absolutely.
What is your sense? What is the way forward? The worst is behind us?
Well, I would say that it was a mixed year. I think that when we looked at what happened up to June or July, it was terrible, right? And after that, I think corporates have been doing better. They've been feeling better. Certainly the inflow of FDI, the way the markets are behaving, the listings which have taken place, there's been a lot to make people ebullient. But the reality is that there's still a lot of work ahead of us. And maybe that's something that we can talk about today, that how do we build India? How do we thrive? Because I certainly think that revive has happened and we've got to look at how we thrive.
So we spoke about survive, revive.
Now we're on thrive.
Okay. But before we talk about thrive, let's talk about the world around us. It's never been this good for India, at least in my experience. You got a startup economy, which is booming. You got a Mahakumbh in Capex, which has started according to Mr. Birla. And you've got this word animal spirits, which I have not used for a while. I'm freely using it now. Is it true? You think you've seen things have just fallen into place for us?
I think they're falling in place. Yes, it's good that we have the startups and that the showcasing of innovation in India is taking place. I do believe there is more to come. I mean, despite the fact that we've had so many listing already. As far as the capex is concerned, it's very necessary. We've had sort of a famine on greenfield ventures. Of course, in the early days of insolvency, a lot of the brownfield ventures, the large companies in cement, steel, they were lapped up by good investors. Now the real issue is, if truly the Mahakumbh does happen, and we do manage to put more than a lota of water into this, and see that investment possibly, in my view, to the view of another 400 billion over the next 6 years happens, for making India a manufacturing economy, to give us $1 trillion of, say, export and manufacturing, point number 2 would also happen.
Which is the more exciting piece according to you? Is it the revival in steel, cement, textile, or the way how startup ecosystem is now thriving? Which is the more exciting part?
I think both are exciting, and of course we didn't talk about number 3, which is the technology itself. But both are exciting because if you look at India, and the India in which you and I have lived, grown up, and which we will continue to celebrate for many years to come, hopefully, is that today services is a large part of our GDP and our exports. I really think that if we look at manufacturing, the best is yet to come. The reason being that you've got to balance both. I mean, I think our minister talks about it when the commerce minister, when he talks about $1 trillion of export and services, as well as $1 trillion on manufacturing. So I think that certainly we should be looking and concentrating now on when there is an interest in India. And by the way, we did a survey, and that survey tells us the interest is in our skills, in our talent, and particularly the talent around technology, and most importantly in our domestic market. So we've got all the things going for us, all 3 are going for us.
When we spoke last, the PLI schemes were getting incubated. That was an idea. Has that translated into real groundwork?
Yes, it has, and I think that there's a lot of enthusiasm around it. And when I talk to companies as well, many of them, in fact, had been asking for more. But sadly, you do have to have ceilings on these. I also think the careful way in which the PLI schemes have been crafted sort of gives us an indication of which are the sectors where India is looking at growth. And you would find some of them are traditional sectors that we've been out of for some time, like textiles and apparel, for example, but in a modernized form where you're looking more in terms of speciality. I would hope that new areas such as food processing would come up. But certainly I think that, electronics and the like would also be very high, automotive parts and components. You have about 6 or 7 sectors that I believe will fuel India's growth.
The report we come out with, you talked about 8 sectors.
Yes.
Same time last year, companies you'd indicated to us, they're telling you, Venkat, tell us how can we save and conserve. Now the same companies perhaps must be telling you, that tell us how can we reinvest what we've saved to grow.
The funny thing is when wave 2 happened, wave 1 formula didn't work. As you rightly said, the first year, it was all about conservation of cash. But in wave 2, people weren't looking in terms of conserving cash. They had already decided where they were going to invest. They had already looked in terms of how they unblock and leverage on what they have and get rid of assets they didn't want, for example. So I think that today, investment strategies, companies are pretty clear on what they want to do. I think the confidence that the government will also support them in this, whether it is by schemes and the like, is there. I think perhaps what we have to now unlock is on regulation to see that the coordination when you say center and states always needs continuous improvement. I get mixed feelings there. A lot of companies say, yes, we made a lot of progress because it is marvelous the way in which single window is working. But there are others who say more can be done. But I think a little more, what in Reiki you call as unblocking needs to happen. Somebody's got to tap the chakras. There are a few chakras that are still blocked. But once you do that unblocking of the chakras, I think everybody is willing to invest.
There's the reason why we saw sugar rush in IT in 2020, middle of 2020. Everybody wanted to just work from home. Every unit wanted to digitize. But the demand is still growing leap and frog. It's that business is when we speak to the listed companies, some unlisted companies, the hiring is excellent. I've been told the Deloitte IT service is doing exceedingly well. What has changed and why is this change now permanent for us?
Maybe the white sugar became brown sugar, right? I think people are a totally different high at this point in time. Certainly, if I look at ITES, it's really on the roll. I think employees as well, if you look at the hot skills, if you look at the sort of pay that is now going out to employees who have the skills, it's phenomenal. There is also a very quiet part in IT that people don't talk much about. And those are what we call the global capability centers, the GICs or GCCs. These are basically the offshore arms of the major Fortune 500 companies. About 25% of the Fortune 500 actually have outfits here in India. They employ about, I think, 1.3 million people. There are about 1,300 of these. And even during the pandemic, a reason why they had minimal disruption is because the work in India continued. And I think the resilience of India was portrayed and captured extremely well in the way in which the IT community and the GCC community in India behaved. A large part of it, by the way, is in global financial services. So yes, there's a lot of demand. There's a lot of demand because if you look at the digital side, it's less than 4% really of what needs to be done is done globally. And when people look as to where they get it done, not only for cost, but also for the skills and the innovation that's available, it's India. So a lot of work is coming to India. A lot of the providers of these services have large outfits in India as well. So this is a boom which is, I think, a minimum of a 15-year boom. And the reason I say 15 years is typically we don't do projections for more than 5. And at best you can hazard it to 15. But probably it may even be a 35-year boom. I don't know.
So you're talking about a double-digit growth for next 15 years. I'll not get into 35, but 10%, 12% growth for next 10 years, 15 years?
Certainly, because I think that last 15 years have been double digit, so there's no reason to believe that the next 15 won't be double digit for the technology industry.
And this would be high-end work this time. It's not going to be pure body shopping model on which the IT structure has been created.
Well, I really don't think that we can say there was body shopping. It's just a question of who owned the IT and how you structured contracts. A lot of it was also based on regulations and the like. And you would still see, between turnkey and time and materials, there would still be a balance. That logically will be there. It's also a question of where the risk sits, who wants to keep the IP, what is a replicable service, etc. But today you've got to also realize the whole nature has changed. Now it's a question of taking people onto the cloud. It's no longer a question of bespoke systems for a group of companies or an entity per se. Now you therefore need specialists. And therefore if you look at any industry, say oil and gas, You can work with 3 players or 5 players in the same industry and do work for them. And you can share resources working on them, which you could not do in the past, where you had separate teams serving each group of companies. So I think that the change which has come now is you are getting far more specialized, and those specialists can work across the sector and are not limited to 1 or 2 companies.
Deloitte has championed this whole issue of sustainability. It is now becoming the center stage. Every boardroom's second conversation or the third conversation is centered around sustainability. What can we give back? That becomes the core with investors also. ESG is something which is a prominent, prominent must-have for a lot of investors. It should pass the ESG muster for an investor to invest in the company. Do you think genuine good work is happening in ESG and sustainability?
I can answer this 3 ways, but let me just first start with the positive. I think sustainability is the right business thing to do. There's a lot of positives. I also believe that not doing anything, you will incur a huge cost. And the third is, of course, that whenever something new comes up, people think that they need to do it, but they want to first dip their toe in the water and try to get things done cheaper. Let's look at the opportunity and why we need to get in. Today, when we talk about, say, supply chain, right? We all talk about China plus one and say, how do we replace China in the ecosystem? Now, when you look at sustainability and saying, what are the bold plays that are going to happen in the next 10 years? If I look at, say, EVs, for example, some of our own companies have got into EV manufacturing. But if you look globally and say, if we have to get into electric vehicles, the supply chain is a new supply chain. It's not a question, making gearboxes and other things, right? It's not about the transmission. It's not about the internal combustion. It's now about a battery-operated vehicle. And therefore, rather than trying to compete to manufacture parts that someone else has been manufacturing for so long, it's now a question of how do we do something new, unique, with our skilled workforce, with our innovation, and most importantly, with the fact that there's technology embedded in this new stuff. So therefore, we should be looking at building an India which invests in these new areas.
But anything that is not green focus, that is not committed to control carbon emission, do you think that business needs to be retooled, reworked?
Certainly, and I mean, things like green hydrogen are a reality, right? So I think that the utilities industry is the most affected. And there again, you've seen that there was a premium on renewables, and I think one of those companies listed recently as well. So you will find that even the old traditional companies are making the change. And the sooner we make it, I mean, India has made a commitment of that 50%, and I think that the sooner we work towards doing it, the better for us. Because remember, finally, the money that comes in to finance this, a lot of that money would also have that expectation that you are going green. And I think indeed the government itself will be looking at incentives to people who are looking in terms of setting up manufacturing facilities. And I said there's a lot of new facilities that have to be built now to see that we go green from the very start.
Let's talk about the most exciting space, and that's the fintech space. You got NBFCs which are trying to become fintech, and fintechs which are trying to become NBFCs. Who will win the war? Who will win the race? Who will be the ultimate winner?
You see, there are two parts to this. One is the customer. And I think that in the Indian piece of it, the person who can serve the customer best because the young customer will win. But I think where people will trip and fail, because this is time and time again, we've seen it in our country, is on regulations. So I think governance is key. In fact, I would spread this to say that this is not just about fintech versus banks. You've seen the way in which the government has had to step in on a number of occasions to bail out companies. I think when we look at India 2.0 or 4.0 or whatever you would like to call it in our 75th year of independence, the reality is that we need to be more responsible for ourselves. I think as businesses, we've got to be more responsible. We've got to do the right things, take the right corporate actions. Because as long as we believe that business needs the intervention of government, it will constrain us from growing. It will create an insecurity in the market, it creates insecurity in people who want to set up business. You will have more entrepreneurs and you will have less industrialists. I make a distinction between the two because the first is building India. The second is building, a business perhaps to sell, perhaps to keep. But the creation of wealth is based on public money. And particularly when you look at the financial services sector, a lot of it is on public interest and public money. And therefore, governance will be key to the success in that sector. Otherwise, people can build out on anything. You will have customers, you will have business. But whether it's sustainable or not depends on the code with which you built it. We've seen it in our own banking system and the new banks that came up.
So you mean to say, when you say sustainability, you're talking about somebody who has a balance sheet, both lending and borrowing franchise. That is sustainability. Just not lending, because a lot of fintechs are only lending.
Yes.
So it needs to be a balance of both.
It's a balance on that and the balance on governance. I mean, basically, you should not have the greed of growth for growth's sake. You've got to have a purpose, and you've got to say, this is the reason why I am in this business.
The government has taken very hard reforms, and sometimes when the environment is such that you can push through some hard reforms. Air India has been divested, land reforms, labor reforms, which is one reform you are particularly excited about and will change the course.
Well, you're right, the government has done a lot of reforms. Somebody actually gave me a statistic of the number of compliances that were there, and I couldn't believe the number because it was some 60,000 plus or whatever, and said that they've now reduced it by 22,000. I don't want to bring numbers in because I can't validate the numbers, and as you know, it's not verifiable.
There's nothing
so
a single window still up, I can assure you.
But the issue is this: if you don't get to single window, you can't get the job done. If land is not available at an economic price, it's going to increase the cost of doing business. It will increase the cost of the product, and you will not be able to sell it at a competitive price. So therefore, I think some of this reform is in the right direction, but there's still a lot of work to be done. So therefore, I just step back and say, look at all the businesses that have been regulated that have worked. And maybe as a country, we need to step back and say, do we need to redefine what is a regulated business and who a regulator is? One of my colleagues, since we're talking about the automotive industry, one of my colleagues in the automotive industry once said this to me so well. He said the purpose of putting brakes in the car is so that the car can go faster, not to slow down the car. I think our regulators need to look at it with the same mindset, that how do they unshackle industry through regulation, rather than how do they slow you down. And I think if we can work Regulation 2.0 with that mindset, to say how can we speed things up, rather than how do we, put the governor to slow down the engine so that you don't go over 100 kilometers an hour. That would help. And of course, with that comes the responsibility that we as individual corporates should have to say that we will be responsible in business that we do.
My final question is that if I look at the global CEOs, starting with Puneet, who's heading Deloitte Global, Parag Agrawal, the CEO of Twitter, you got Sundar Pichai, Google. What is this with Indian CEOs who are now getting recognized globally? It's not Chinese or Korean CEOs that are getting recognized. It's a very proud moment for us, but I'm just trying to understand the why behind it.
I think we are natural entrepreneurs, right? And I think we think out of the box, we build consensus, and I think most importantly, we are risk takers. The reality is that in business, you have to take risks. I mean, when we talk about risk and reward, there's a reason why you talk about risk and reward. But as I said, you just need the right governance when you look at risk and reward. Because when you look at risk, you always say there's the inherent risk, there's a control risk, and how you manage risk is, you manage it or you transfer it, right? So I think it's all about risk. If you have the ability to take risk, if you're able to take the bold bets, you do prosper. And finally, of course, the innovative spirit. You should be willing to innovate, and you should choose the right people to innovate. Age does not play a role in it. Each one of us is seeing today that, and all these people you mentioned, many of them that you mentioned, actually get here at a very, very young age.
Yes.
So age certainly has something to do with it. And maybe India has more young people than anywhere else.
Well, the demographics are speaking like that, but really nice to meet you, and thank you very much. I mean, you really outlined the big picture for us very nicely. Wish you all the best for 2022, and we should celebrate India turning 75 very proudly.
Absolutely. 75 years young.
Yes.
Thank you.